Every religion on earth believes in an afterlife, a spirit world, and television takes religion seriously. But for the rest of its output, the spirit life is really regarded as, well, so much bunk and fit only for entertainment. So we get spooky movies with scary music, mental mediums entertaining large audiences by contacting the dead, and illusionists who try to assure us that there's no such thing as psychic phenomena, as demonstrated by their clever tricks. And when the paranormal is taken seriously, well, it's the skeptics who win the day. Materialism is all. But you know, there is another side to this story. Little known evidence that our consciousness really does survive the death of our bodies. This is the grave where my mother and father are buried. The question is, when they were put in the ground, was that the end of them, or has some element of them still lived on? When my mother was still alive, I went to see a medium, and the medium said, "I've got two people here in spirit. One is a man, and she gave my father's name, and the other is a woman, and she gave my sister's name." She then gave me some messages, and I was really pretty impressed. But was it telepathy? Was she simply reading my mind? Or were the spirits of my family members there in the room with us? Well, since then I've done a lot of research. And you know, ever since the 19th century, there's been empirical evidence accumulating that we do indeed survive death. I know not everybody agrees with this. Take the atheist Richard Dawkins. He says that thinking that anyone lives on after death is simply dangerous nonsense. Well, he can't have done the same reading as I have, or maybe he's not open to persuasion on this issue. Look at the world around you. I mean, the ecosystem of the earth is absolutely amazing. Is it a mere pointless fluke? And human beings, their intellect, their creativity is really remarkable at times. Surely they're not just meaningless accidents. In the 1870s, Sir William Crookes was one eminent scientist to conduct controlled experiments in the paranormal, and these convinced him that we survive death.
Well, Sir William Crookes, of course, was the eminent Victorian scientist who was knighted by Queen Victoria for his researches in science, but he became interested in psychic research, and he investigated a number of very prominent mediums and came to the conclusion that they were displaying genuine paranormal phenomena. And so, quite bravely, I think, he wrote it up. It was published, and then the heavens fell on him. All the respectable scientists said that he had no business being taken in by these charlatans.
Despite this criticism, interest in spiritualism was running high at the end of the 19th century, and in 1882, Cambridge professor Henry Sidgwick became the first president of Britain's Society for Psychical Research, the SPR. Two of his chief associates were Edmund Gurney and Frederick Myers. A poet and classics fellow, Myers was a very learned man. And this trio, with the help of friends, researched hauntings, apparitions, and deathbed visions. And Myers became the author of a book entitled Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. Published over a century ago, it's still in print today. But their greatest contribution came after Myers died in 1901. Yes, after he died. He started sending evidence of his own survival through the automatic writings of mediums in India, the United States, and Britain. These people lived thousands of miles apart, they didn't know each other, and they couldn't collude. They were told to send their scripts to London. Now this process lasted 30 years, and the SPR now holds 12,000 pages of writings known as the cross correspondences. Individually, the scripts don't mean a lot, but when you work out the puzzle, join them together, you find that they do make sense. As Myers himself said, and I quote his own words, "Record the bits, and when fitted they will make the whole. I will give the words between you, neither alone can read, but together they will give the clue." The cross correspondences were complicated jigsaw puzzles with classical references. Let me give an example. On January the 17th, 1904, the sister of Rudyard Kipling, a lady called Mrs. Alice Fleming, a medium, received in automatic writing a message purportedly coming from the dead Frederick Myers. Now, being the wife of an Indian Army officer, dabbling in the occult was not really approved of, so Mrs. Fleming used the pseudonym Mrs. Holland. Myers told Mrs. Holland to send to the SPR in London the biblical reference 1 Corinthians 16, verse 12. He told the SPR in his message that he'd tried to get Mrs. Holland to write this verse out in Greek, but that he couldn't control her hand well enough to form Greek characters. On the same day, thousands of miles away in England, another medium, Mrs. Margaret Verrill, did receive the verse, and she wrote it down, and this is what it said. "Watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit you like men, be strong." And here is that inscription that Frederick Myers used to walk under every day while he was here at Cambridge University. On another occasion, Myers gave to the medium Mrs. Piper in Boston, Massachusetts, a list of 40 references to the mythical River Leith in Ovid's poem Metamorphoses. The River Leith is the river of forgetfulness in Hades, but Mrs. Piper was not sufficiently educated to know that. 10 months later, Mrs. Willett in England was sent a list of 40 references to the River Leith from Virgil's Aeneid. Well, when challenged why had he given 2 lists to 2 separate mediums, Myers' reply was that he wanted to prove that this was not a case of telepathy, that he, Myers, on the other side, had selected the references. My final example of a cross-correspondence again involves Mrs. Holland in India. She received in automatic writing a message from the dead poet Roden Noel, who in fact was unknown to her. The message said to ask A.W. what the date May the 26th, 1894 meant to him, and if he didn't know, he was to consult Nora. Well, Mrs. Holland made nothing of this, so she sent the message to the SPR in London, and there they worked out that A.W. was Dr. A.W. Verrill, and Nora was Dr. Eleanor Sidgwick, and the date given by Roden Noel was the date of his own death.
None of these cases could have happened if the destruction of the brain was the destruction of the personality. It was only reasonable to suppose that they were doing this on the other side to show that they were actually still in existence, still had their memories, still had their intelligence.
Survival is now a sufficiently well-established fact to be beyond denial by any reasonable person. That was the conclusion of Colin Brooks Smith after a lengthy, in-depth study of the cross-correspondences. And he felt that the Society for Psychical Research should make an announcement of this momentous scientific breakthrough, which he felt was of prime importance to mankind. But the SPR has its own share of sceptics, and it failed to make the announcement. Indeed, sceptics are a major issue in the denial of survival after death.
Even if you accept that the phenomena are supernatural, if you like, paranormal, if you like, then there are still other explanations, such as, well, maybe the mediums were getting the information from the minds of living people rather than from the minds of deceased people. This is called the super ESP theory, that there are always possibilities of getting the stuff from living people or from the physical world. But in the end, of course, that explanation becomes even less credible than the suggestion of survival itself, because you have to suggest that the medium can rummage through the minds of people, both present and those who are not present, rummage through the environment to get information about people who she has never met and about people with whom she has no emotional contact at all. So that you have to look at the balance of probabilities, and the balance of probabilities, I would say, are overwhelming in favour of survival. I think one of the questions we're most frequently asked is why the scientific community does not accept the reality of psychic phenomena in spite of the strength of the evidence. And there are various answers to that. Very, very briefly, of course, many scientists are not interested in this. They're interested in their own area of work. This lies way outside their expertise and their interest, and they don't follow it up, they don't read the evidence. Then there is a feeling amongst a lot of scientists that if these things are true, then it calls into question the whole of our material understanding of science and of the world. Again, the answer to that is no, it doesn't. It just lies outside a lot of our understanding of the material world. Then there is a very strong argument, I think, in favour of the fact that many scientists just do not want these things to be true. You can actually talk to them on their own, and many people will express an interest, and they may even express a belief in the field, but they can't do it publicly because they feel that it would actually threaten their reputations, would threaten their careers and so on.
This book is by Australian lawyer Victor Zammit. Skeptics denying the strength of his evidence for survival bother him a great deal. So he's offered $1 million for anyone who can prove that it's not valid.
My challenge to the skeptics, closed-minded skeptics, I said, what's your authority for this? Give me your objective authority that there is nothing. You know, I presented the evidence. Now the onus shifts onto the closed-minded skeptic to show where, when, how, and why the evidence cannot be admitted.
Alfred Russel Wallace, the naturalist and the co-originator of the theory of natural selection, concluded that there is a spiritual origin for man's higher mental faculties. Sir Oliver Lodge, the physicist, invented the loudspeaker, and he transmitted radio signals a year before Marconi. The principal of Birmingham University, his investigations left him in no doubt that we survive our own demise. Thomas Alva Edison, creator of the light bulb and the phonograph, worked on a machine to allow direct communication with the dead. And so did John Logie Baird, the inventor of television in 1925, and colour television and video recording as early as 1928. So if leading scientists say there's another dimension after death, shouldn't we take it seriously too? I'm not talking simple religious faith here, I'm talking about the empirical evidence, and we're really talking about the physics of reality. Now there's plenty more evidence, apart from the cross-correspondences, to suggest that we survive our bodily death, and I'm going to come to that evidence right now. Between 1914 and 1918, over 9 million soldiers died in the Great War. Against this backdrop of wholesale slaughter, a single life may seem insignificant, but not to their families. And these soldiers are remembered at war memorials across the globe. This is Nottingham High School for Boys, and behind me you can see their war memorial. It lists the names of over 200 students who died in the First World War. 2 of them were brothers, Eric and Tom Whitlock, and it's Tom who concerns us here. He died in action on the 24th of August 1916. He was only 20 years old. 34 years later, he communicated at a séance in Cambridgeshire in July and then again in December 1950, and then again in 1952. Now, nobody attending these séances knew anything about Tom, which is why he's known as a drop-in communicator. But he gave several details about himself, and these were subsequently verified by research. It was found that documentary evidence was spread across several sources, so it's very unlikely that fraud, or telepathy, or even super ESP can explain this phenomenon. He gave his name. He said he was in the Scottish battalion of the Northumberland Fusiliers. He gave his rank as second lieutenant. He gave the date he died in action as the 24th of August 1916. He said he lived in Nottingham, and he said his mother was on the other side with him. This is a picture of Tom from the school archive. This really does suggest that Tom Whitlock was a spirit communicating from the other side. The official list of officer fatalities showed that Whitlock was indeed a second lieutenant in the Northumberland Fusiliers, so the information he gave was correct. And just the same with his death certificate. This shows the date of death that he claimed it to be. And as you can see, his name appears on the roll of honour at his old school. There's far more detail in this case, and I'm just going to have to skip it. But for many people, this provides excellent proof of life after death. It's stronger because the seance members had never heard of him before. In years gone by, when it was necessary to protect the interests of the family, the names in this case were changed, and it was known in the literature as the Harry Stockbridge case. This is the pretty village of Scole, deep in the English countryside in Norfolk. It was here in 1993 that a series of seances took place that many people argue provide definitive proof of life after death. Behind me is Street Farmhouse, where the home circle sat twice a week for 5 years. The mediums were Diana and Alan Bennett, and Sandra and Robin Foy. This book summarises what happened at Scole under the observation of 3 investigators from the Society for Psychical Research. Professor David Fontana was one of that trio.
There were materializations, there were lights, there were voices, we were touched by so-called spirit hands, we were able to actually shake hands with so-called disembodied spirits. We had information coming through the mediums about facts that they would not normally have known because these related to the history of the SPR and so on. So when you put the whole lot together, it's rather like a bundle of sticks. You might break one stick, but if you put a bundle together, it becomes harder and harder to break it. In other words, it's harder and harder to explain that full range of phenomena that we experienced.
We had apports, which were little gifts brought by spirit people for us. There were over 80 of those over the period of the experiment. We had psychic photography, which ran on after the still photography into video photographs, where spirit people were able to put their image on the photograph itself. We had spirit lights, which eventually were used for healing, effective healing, as they entered a patient's body. We had materialization, spirit people. Overall, there were so many different things.
Engineers and mathematicians, criminologists and psychologists, astrophysicists from NASA, and even a stage magician witnessed these physical manifestations, either in the village of Scole or when the group went abroad to demonstrate their work. But was it fraudulent?
Well, there was absolutely no way that fraud could have occurred, because I was a witness to this over 5 years, as was my wife, and we saw over 1,000 hours of physical phenomena during that period. The fact that we weren't searched personally was basically because the researchers never actually asked us to be searched. We would have complied with that without any problem, but also they did have the opportunity and used it to search both the séance room before and after each sitting they attended.
All that I can say is that, particularly in the case of Scole, but in other cases that I've investigated, not only have I no doubts as to the honesty of the people who are involved in the case, but also you can set up sufficient controls to virtually eliminate the possibility of fraud. You can also suggest that magicians, conjurers, call them what you like, could be given all the opportunities to duplicate the phenomena under the same circumstances in which we saw them, and see if you get any takers. In fact, in our experience, no, although we've invited conjurers to come along, try the same thing, we'll give them every help, but we haven't found a single taker.
The supervision by scientists ensured that the phenomena were of great scientific interest. Take a look at this. Is this a photograph from the afterlife, from another dimension? These photos, and many more like them, were produced without a camera. Spirit scientists on the other side allegedly imprinted them onto film supplied by the SPR. This remained sealed in its factory wrapping during the séance and kept inside a padlocked box. The investigators developed many of the films themselves, so the mediums could not cheat. But critics of Skoll have found fault with the padlocked box design, and compare these. This picture came from a Skoll séance, while this similar photo comes from film manipulated by skeptics using ordinary methods to suggest there was fraud. But that hardly accounts for this picture of otherworldly pyramids, or this one scrawled with, "Can you see behind the moon?" or these shots taken from Skoll video. One shows a man's head floating in a bubble, possibly in another dimension, and this other one looks remarkably like the face of an alien. Then there's a single photograph over a metre long. It's reminiscent of the cross correspondences. It's as though Frederick Myers, dead for over 90 years, had come back especially to create a puzzle on a print. The name Diotima is the Greek goddess of love, reflecting Myers' classical interests. A sentence in French says, "It is but the first word that counts," and that comes from his book Human Personality and its Survival of Bodily Death. Then there's a Myers poem, which begins, "That hour may come when earth no more can keep tireless her year-long voyage through the deep." Next comes a passage in Greek that says, "It is not yet apparent what we will become." Now the origins of these quotations were only solved with verbal help from spirits on the other side. But the Skoll experiment produced other marvels. For example, there was one print which showed a design for a gadget to enable spirits to communicate with people on Earth without using a medium. The trouble was, when it was built, it didn't work properly. So an additional film was provided by the spirit side, adding 2 more coils. Now here's the weird thing. That coil photograph was signed TAE, the same initials as Thomas Alva Edison, who died in 1931, but he was known when alive to be working on such a device. Now the signature was sent to the Edison Foundation in America without revealing its origin, and they confirmed that it looked like his writing. The signature on the right you can see is Edison's when he was alive, and the other signature could be his when he was dead. According to Professor Ellison of the SPR, who built this gadget, it was not a radio, nor indeed was it an electronic device. And yet, when it was plugged into an amplifier in January 1997, a message was obtained that was 20 minutes long, and amongst its sentiments were these words. "Hello, my friends," it said. "It is hoped in the future this system will enable us to communicate with distant dimensions. Many people here feel as I do, that this work is of the utmost importance to mankind, and therefore are willing to put their hearts into these experiments." The resounding question is, whose voice gave this message, and where did it come from? Well, according to the SPR, it could be the afterlife. This is known as Instrumental Transcommunication, or ITC. And rather interestingly, ITC has been given endorsement by the Vatican itself as a form of communication with the spirit world. In 1921, this man became the founder and chancellor of the Catholic University of Milan. Father Agostino Gamelli was a neurophysiologist and a prominent Franciscan. His Institute of Psychology was the most prominent in Italy, and in Rome a large teaching hospital is named in his honour. On the 17th of September 1952, Gemelli was in his laboratory with Father Pellegrino Ernetti, working on some recordings of Gregorian chant on an old-style tape recorder of the time that used wire instead of tape, and the wire kept breaking and needing repair. In his exasperation, Father Gemelli called out to his deceased father, which was a habit of his when he was frustrated. Well, when the wire was repaired, they didn't expect to hear what they did hear. Instead of Gregorian chant, there was the sound of Gemelli's deceased father saying, "Of course I help you. I'm always with you." Now, I know this is a preposterous story, but this man's credentials are impeccable. And he asked, "Is that really you, Father?" The reply recorded was, "Don't you recognize me, Testoni?" Now, Testoni was Gemelli's father's pet name for his son, and this impressed Gemelli deeply, because it was deeply evidential that this voice was coming from the other side. Naturally, both Gemelli and Ernetti repeated these experiments. They then requested an interview with Pope Pius XII in Rome, who, surprisingly, agreed that this could mark the beginning of a new scientific study that would confirm faith in the beyond. So the Catholic Church has discreetly accepted trying to contact the dead, if done for scientific purposes, or to help the bereaved. And the manifestations of electronic voice phenomena, known as EVP, or instrumental transcommunication, known as ITC, has continued apace, with thousands of researchers doing this work all around the globe. Now, it's not really surprising that ears pricked up in far-flung places, and one of those places was Hollywood.
What you are about to hear is real. It has not been edited or enhanced. It is the voice of Ruth Baxter. This voice was recorded in August 2003. Ruth Baxter died in 1987. Electronic voice phenomenon, EVP, is the process by which the dead, through sound and image, communicate with the living through the static and white noise of modern electronic devices.
As early as 1930, the medium Suzanne Max Getting predicted that devices would replace mediums as a way of communicating with the spirit world. In the future, she said, photographs would come from distant dimensions, and the results would be magnificent. 5 years later, another medium, an American, Edith Ellis, made a similar prediction, and so did the author Alice Bailey. And since then, EVP and ITC have really taken off. Much of present-day EVP research was inspired by the Swedish film producer Fredrik Jürgensen. In 1959, he found anomalous voices on his tape recorder after recording birdsong in the countryside with nobody around. Subsequently, his dead mother called him by his pet name, and he devoted himself to this research. Jürgensen's work encouraged the Estonian intellectual Konstantin Raudive to record otherworldly voices on his machines, and he published a landmark book called Breakthrough. During Raudive's experiments in England under strict controls, Sir Robert Mayer, the banker and philanthropist, recognized the voice of his recently dead friend, the pianist Arthur Schnabel. This is the province of Galicia in the far northwest corner of Spain, facing onto the Atlantic Ocean. And I've come here to find out more about using electronic devices as a way of communicating directly with the dead, without a medium. Specifically, I've come to visit Dr. Anabela Cardoso. She's a Portuguese diplomat, and she's deeply involved in this research, and she has an international reputation. When she's working in her studio, she's in touch with a spirit team on the other side called Rio de Tempo. Otherwise known as Time Stream, this group is also helping researchers elsewhere in Europe.
I turned them on in white noise, so-called white noise, static noise between stations, the noise that you can hear now, and this one, that one, that one, that one, that one, and that one. And I have had voices that start here, then they continue speaking from that one, they go into that one, and then they go into that one. And they are all tuned into different frequencies of the shortwave band. So I sit here and I start experimenting as if I were experimenting for EVP, which is like this. You sit here, as I am now, and you speak to the invisible communicators. And so you start speaking as you would speak to a visible communicator. The truth is that I know from my own experimentation that the voices call me by my name. In certain cases it can be universally recognized. That is my name, Annabella Cardoso. Sometimes by my pet name, Bella. They say it's é o teu pai, João Cardoso, that was my father's name, or it's your brother, Luís Cardoso, it's your grandmother. So, and they reply to my questions, obviously, and I mean beyond any doubt.
Personally, when I'm told that a pet dog has communicated with its owner from the other side, using human language, well, my boggle threshold is exceeded. The phrases in EVP can be extremely short, open to interpretation, and the white noise background can be so loud that it's difficult to understand what's being said, although I'm assured that the quality is sometimes excellent. Back in the 1980s, George Meek and Bill O'Neill, two American researchers, built a device called Spiricom 4, and using that they contacted the late Dr. George Jeffries Muller, a person they didn't know, who had died in 1968, 12 years earlier. They talked to him for over 20 hours, a lot of technical stuff. He was an engineer by background. He provided his social security number. He told them where to find his death certificate. And George Meek managed to locate one of his publications in an obscure library. So it's hardly surprising if researchers argue that proof of life after death will be undeniable using these techniques.
Everything indicates that the future will bring this electronic communication with the next dimension into daily life, as Friedrich Jürgensen already predicted.
Imagine you're a caterpillar feeding on a leaf when a fly lands next to you. Fortunately, the fly speaks caterpillar language, and it says, "You know, when you go into your chrysalis at the end of your life, don't think of it as your coffin, because I know you will not die. Instead, you will emerge into a new life with wings. You will be beautiful, graceful, and fly wherever you wish." And you, the caterpillar, says between mouthfuls of that juicy leaf, "No, that can't possibly be true. When you're dead, that's it, you're finished." But as humans, we know that the fly is correct. The caterpillar does re-emerge into a new life as a butterfly. It's called metamorphosis. And the fly does something just as strange, turning from a maggot into a fly. So by the same reasoning, why should it not be possible for human beings to do something just as strange, to lift out of their bodies into a new spiritual life? Eminent scientists say this is possible. Sir William Barrett, Professor of Physics at the Royal College of Science in Dublin, researched and accepted survival, and he helped to found the American Society for Psychical Research and the British SPR. Professor William James of Harvard, the eminent psychologist and philosopher, held similar views and was another founder of the American SPR. James Hislop, Professor of Ethics and Logic at Columbia University, said, "I regard the existence of discarnate spirits as scientifically proved, and no longer refer to the skeptic as having any right to speak on the subject." and Lord Rayleigh, the Nobel Prize winner who discovered the gas argon. He said, "I have seen enough to convince me that those are wrong who wish to prevent investigation by casting ridicule on those who may feel inclined to engage in it." Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, agreed with these views and was the most famous ever protagonist of survival. And then there's Arthur Balfour, Britain's Prime Minister from 1902 to 1905. He was a philosopher and the Chancellor of Cambridge University and Edinburgh University. Even Albert Einstein, the greatest scientist of the 20th century, said, "It is entirely possible that behind the perception of our senses, worlds are hidden of which we are unaware." If you're finding this information difficult to accept, remember the stature of these people. Distinguished intellectuals, great minds, most certainly not fools. And if you want evidence that investigation into this topic can change minds, well, then there's no better case than that of Dr. Richard Hodgson. Born in 1855 in Australia, he graduated from Melbourne University. Later he became a lecturer at Cambridge and a renowned skeptic and a debunker of mediums. He exposed the medium Madame Blavatsky, the co-founder of the Theosophical Society. The SPR sent him to India especially for this investigation, and critics say that Hodgson was both dishonest and biased by his determination to unmask her. In 1986, the SPR officially retracted its verdict on her. But regardless of this, Madame Blavatsky's reputation at the time was damaged, while Hodgson gained great kudos from the episode. "Nearly all the professional mediums are a gang of vulgar tricksters," he said, in league with one another. And it was this sceptical reputation that led to his arriving in Boston, Massachusetts, to investigate another medium, Mrs. Leonora Piper. Exposing her in fraud would put yet another feather in his cap. But despite meticulous observation in hundreds of sittings over 18 years, there was no wrongdoing to discover. Instead, he became convinced of the afterlife. "Frankly," he said, "I went to Mrs. Piper about 12 years ago with the aim of unmasking her. I entered her house profoundly materialistic, not believing in the continuance of life after death. Now, I say, I believe. The truth has been given to me," he said, "in such a way as to remove the possibility of a doubt." So how did this conversion happen? Mrs. Piper was a conservative, middle-aged woman, but this photograph, taken in England by Frederick Meyer's wife, shows her in another light. She was the most remarkable mental medium in the history of psychical research.
Stars, real stars, come along quite rarely. Now, Mrs. Piper was probably the best example because she was investigated by such careful and well-known researchers. The great Professor William James was the first person to investigate her, and she was also investigated under very tightly controlled conditions, as when, for example, she was invited to Britain. She stayed with Sir Oliver Lodge and family over a period of time, and he was able even to control her mail, quite apart from putting private detectives to follow her, to make sure that she was not getting information which she would then feed back as if it came from the dead.
From his very first sitting, Hodgson was startled by Mrs. Piper's revelations about himself, despite not even knowing his name. He noted that a controlling spirit, Dr. Finway, took over Mrs. Piper's body when she was in trance. That Dr. Finway sometimes lied. So Dr. Hodgson saw Finway not as a discarnate spirit, which is what he claimed to be, but as a secondary personality of Mrs. Piper's own subconscious, possessing nonetheless incredible telepathic powers. Since Hodgson had no proof that Dr. Finway had ever lived, why should he not be part of his subconscious? Then, in 1892, a strange thing happened. It was at this time that in New York the Statue of Liberty was still almost new. The city was coming to terms with increasing traffic, and a friend of Hodgson, called George Pellew, managed to fall off his horse and he was killed. George Pellew took over from Dr. Finway as the spirit control of Mrs. Piper. After that, Hodgson brought along over 150 anonymous sitters, and of these, 30 were the unnamed friends of Pellew himself, and Pellew recognized them all. It was George Pellew who made the spirit life and the afterlife possible for Hodgson to accept. Pellew was responsible for Hodgson's courageous conversion. And Mrs. Piper even picked out Pellew from a mixed collection of 32 photographs. She recognized it was his spirit who took control of her entranced body while she was vacating it. Hodgson said of Pellew, "The continual manifestation of this personality, so different from Finway, with its own reservoir of memories, and its swift appreciation of references to his friends, and its little give and take in incidental conversations with myself, has helped in producing a conviction of the actual presence of Pellew, which it would be quite impossible to impart by a mere enumeration of verifiable statements." When Dr. Hodgson died in 1905, aged only 50, Professor William Newbold of Pennsylvania University took over the investigation of Mrs. Piper, and amazingly, Hodgson himself began communicating through Mrs. Piper. Communicating from the other side, he told Professor Newbold, "I find now difficulties such as a blind man would experience trying to find his hat. I'm not wholly conscious of my utterances because they come out automatically. I understand so much better the modus operandi than I did when I was in your world." Perhaps that explains why Dr. Hodgson preferred to express himself through automatic writing rather than through the voice of Mrs. Piper. Mrs. Piper's mediumship was truly remarkable. She could let one spirit use her hand in automatic writing, while a different spirit simultaneously spoke through her voice. She was never caught in fraud, even when the SPR set private detectives on her, both at home in the United States and during a visit to England. After great service to psychical research, she died in 1950. According to the materialistic view, consciousness is the product of the 3 pounds of tissue inside your skull, and when your brain dies, that's it. Death is annihilation. And yet there's impressive evidence from near-death experience studies that we can perceive things outside of the human torso. The most famous case is that of Pam Reynolds of the United States. BBC Television, the Discovery Channel, and the National Geographic Channel have all made programs about her, interviewing the surgeons, the researchers, and Pam herself. She had a dangerous aneurysm deep within her brain which was threatening her life. To treat her, they had to stop her heart. They had to drain the blood out of her head and keep her body at a low temperature while they worked. By any standard, she was dead on the table. And yet from the operating theatre ceiling, she looked down at what the surgeons were doing to her. And then she went into an afterlife dimension where she met dead relatives. Afterwards, she described instruments and incidents that she couldn't possibly have seen given her condition.
At some point in time, I was reminded that it was time to go back. Of course, I had made my decision to go back before I ever laid down on that table. But, you know, the more I was there, the better I liked it. And my uncle was the one who brought me back down to the body. But then I got to where the body was, and I looked at the thing, and I for sure did not want to get in it, because it looked pretty much like what it was, as in void of life.
This is a classic near-death experience occurring under extremely monitored medical conditions, where every known vital sign and basically every clinical sign of life and death was being monitored at the time. And that's what makes her case so remarkable and so valuable to us.
Now, many scientists say this is simply impossible. But how can our unitary sense of self come about from an essentially electrochemical process? To say a non-conscious process results in awareness has yet to be proven. Many philosophers, including Plato from ancient Greece and René Descartes from 17th century France, argue that mind and brain are separate entities, with the brain acting as a kind of radio receiver or a mediator for the mind, instead of being the physiological originator of thought. No purely biological mechanism has yet shown how the brain creates awareness, or even where it stores memory. It's true, MRI scans show a correlation between brain activity and different mental states. Specific thoughts, memories, and emotions activate multiple groups of brain cells, often located in different parts of the brain. But this does not prove that brain cells themselves produce thoughts. Then there's the problem of free will. If an electrochemical process is a prerequisite of consciousness, then how do we have free will? If a biological process precedes any decision we make. Take an amoeba, a single-celled organism, so it has no brain cells. Yet it can swim, it finds food, it learns, and it multiplies. So brain activity does not underlie its survival strategy. In 1980, there was a mathematics student at Sheffield University with an IQ of 126. Yet a CAT scan showed that he had virtually no brain at all. Instead of 2 hemispheres filling his cranial cavity, he had about 1 millimetre of cerebral tissue covering the top of his spinal column. And yet he lived a normal life, and he got a first-class degree in maths. This led Professor John Lorber to ask, do humans need their brains at all? The student's brain weighed about 50 to 150 grams, instead of the usual 1.5 kilos. In Marseille in 2007, a civil servant was found with up to 75% of his brain missing.
I think the types of cases Lorber identified, people with severe hydrocephalus who have virtually no brain tissue left and yet have normal IQs, tell us that our normal ways of thinking about how the brain relates to mental function are grossly inadequate. If we seem to be able to function quite well in terms of mental faculties with little brain tissue, then we need to rethink what is the relation between brain and mind.
So could consciousness be a fundamental quality of the universe, like mass or gravity in physics, an independent scientific entity? And if mind is not dependent upon the brain, then survival of consciousness after death becomes more understandable. Sir John Eccles, the Nobel Prize winner for his work on brain synapses, was one of the 20th century's greatest neuroscientists. The unity of conscious experience, he argued, was provided by the mind and not by the machinery of the brain. Look at all these books on life after death and the paranormal. It's only a fraction of what's available, but each book is a testament to survival, although admittedly some of them are more scientifically based than others. And you can criticize some of the contents of these books. But taken together, they provide a mountain of material which only a skeptic would conclude amounts to nothing at all, not one jot of it. Personally, I'm impressed by much of the evidence in books like these, and the intellectuals I've mentioned in this programme have also found adequate evidence upon which to base their conclusions. You know, there's an increasing number of scientists who believe that if there's going to be an effective theory of everything, well then it's going to have to include consciousness as one of its elements. And that rather puts in perspective the current work of physicists who are trying to join up relativity theory with quantum mechanics, string theory, and the Big Bang. If consciousness is not a part of their conclusions, not a part of their theories, well, can they really be successful? As Max Planck, the founder of quantum theory, said, science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature, because in the last analysis, we ourselves are part of the mystery that we're trying to solve. But that won't stop people from trying to understand reality as best they can. In my view, the tide is turning against pure materialism. Give it 20 years, and I think we'll see the start of a paradigm shift, in which spirit and other dimensions are regarded as an essential part of understanding reality. Science will start to modify its theories. And scientists more and more are acknowledging that where we're at now is certainly not all there is. As the free-thinking writer Victor Hugo put it, an invasion of armies can be resisted, but not an idea whose time has come.
The question of consciousness and whether the universe is essentially conscious is absolutely fundamental now to physics. There are many theories, and certainly Eastern theories, which argue that this is so. It looks as if the West may be going that way. And if one does come down to the conclusion that in fact consciousness is primary, then we have a very different outlook on this whole question of survival.
When we began this programme, I referred to the atheist Richard Dawkins asserting that belief in an afterlife was simply dangerous nonsense. But if consciousness does survive death, then Dawkins would be incorrect. And in this programme, we've seen 6 different kinds of evidence, all suggesting the survival of spirit. The Australian lawyer Victor Zammit says that the 24 chapters of supportive evidence in his book has yet to be refuted. So you decide, is it dangerous nonsense? I don't think so. But the point is this: if you think that consciousness or some element of you survives the death of the body, then it changes our understanding of ourselves and of the world.